They live here now.
They live here without my consent?
She had barely finished saying the words when every conversation in the room came to a complete stop. The laughter disappeared. Glasses remained suspended in midair. Friends who had gathered to celebrate one man's greatest achievement suddenly found themselves witnessing something none of them could have imagined. After 20 years of working overtime, sacrificing weekends, and putting every extra dollar aside to finally purchase the home he had dreamed about since he was a young man, Daniel Harper stood at his own front door unable to believe what he was hearing. His younger brother, Ryan Harper, stood comfortably on the front porch beside his wife, Emily, while two large suitcases rested at their feet as though they had arrived at a hotel already booked in their names. Then their mother, Patricia Harper, stepped forward with a warm smile that carried not the slightest hint of uncertainty. "Good news," she announced confidently. "Ryan and Emily will be living here from now on. No request. No conversation. No explanation. Just a decision that had apparently already been made for Daniel." In that single moment, the house he had spent decades earning no longer felt like it belonged to him. What would you do if the place you called home suddenly became the center of a family takeover? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For everyone attending that celebration, Daniel appeared to be living the American dream. At 57 years old, he had recently retired from a successful career managing regional distribution centers for one of the country's largest logistics companies. Friends admired his discipline because they knew his success had never come from luck. He had grown up in a modest household where every dollar mattered, and after graduating from community college, he immediately entered the workforce instead of chasing expensive dreams he couldn't afford. While many of his friends upgraded cars every few years and financed vacations they would spend months paying off, Daniel chose a different path. He worked extra shifts whenever they became available, accepted transfers to difficult locations that others avoided, and invested nearly every bonus instead of spending it. There were years when he barely took a vacation because every financial decision revolved around one goal. Someday, he wanted to own a home that represented security rather than debt. Someday, he wanted a place where no landlord could raise the rent, no lease renewal could force another move, and no uncertainty could threaten the future he had spent decades building. By every measure, that evening was supposed to celebrate the completion of that lifelong mission. Ryan's life had followed a very different road. 8 years younger than Daniel, he possessed the kind of personality that made friends quickly but often left responsibilities unfinished. He was funny, outgoing, and naturally charismatic, qualities that helped him through situations where discipline might have served him better. Throughout adulthood he changed careers more times than anyone in the family could remember. Construction one year. Real estate the next. Sales after that. Every new opportunity arrived with enormous excitement and endless confidence, yet somehow every promising beginning eventually ended with another explanation about circumstances beyond his control. Daniel rarely criticized him publicly because he understood that everyone lives differently, but privately he often wondered whether Ryan had ever experienced the pressure of carrying long-term responsibility without expecting someone else to soften the consequences when things went wrong. Their mother, Patricia, always believed Ryan simply needed one more chance. She never viewed him as irresponsible. Instead, she described him as someone who had simply been unlucky. Over time, those explanations became so common that few family members questioned them anymore. Anyone observing Patricia during family gatherings would have described her as warm, generous, and deeply devoted to her children. She remembered birthdays, organized holiday dinners, and insisted that family should always come before everything else. Yet beneath that caring image existed a pattern that only Daniel truly recognized because he had lived with it since childhood. Whenever Ryan forgot a responsibility, Patricia stepped in. Whenever Ryan struggled financially, Patricia quietly found a solution. Whenever Daniel succeeded, she smiled proudly but rarely celebrated because she expected him to succeed. Dependability had become Daniel's identity, while rescue had become Ryan's. Neither brother consciously chose those roles, yet both eventually accepted them as normal. Years passed, careers developed, marriages happened, and still the same pattern continued without anyone openly discussing it. Daniel convinced himself it wasn't worth arguing about. Ryan assumed family simply worked that way. Patricia believed she was keeping peace between her sons. None of them realized that years of small decisions were slowly creating one enormous collision that would eventually arrive at the front door of Daniel's new home carrying 2 suitcases in an expectation that would shock everyone present. As the silence stretched across the living room, Daniel searched every face around him, hoping someone would laugh and admit the whole thing was an elaborate joke prepared for his housewarming. Nobody did. His co-workers stood frozen beside the dining table, unsure whether they should quietly leave or pretend nothing unusual had happened. His neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the Harper family. Ryan, however, looked surprisingly relaxed. He rested one hand on the handle of the larger suitcase while Emily stood close beside him with an uneasy smile that suggested she understood just enough about the situation to know it wasn't unfolding the way she had expected. Patricia remained completely composed. She looked around the room with the confidence of someone announcing wonderful news rather than introducing an idea that had never been discussed with the homeowner. Daniel finally broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was confusion behind every word. "Mom, what exactly do you mean they live here now?" Patricia answered without hesitation. "Exactly what I said. Their lease ended this morning. They needed somewhere stable, and this house has plenty of room. Family helps family." The simplicity of her answer somehow made the moment even harder to understand. Daniel looked toward Ryan, expecting his younger brother to step in and explain that there had been some misunderstanding. Instead, Ryan shrugged lightly and smiled as though the difficult part of the conversation had already passed. "It's only until we get back on our feet," he said. "A few months at the most. Mom said you wouldn't mind." Those final 6 words echoed inside Daniel's mind far louder than anything else that had been said that evening. Mom said you wouldn't mind. He hadn't received a phone call. He hadn't been asked whether he had spare rooms available. No one had mentioned financial trouble. There had been no conversation about temporary arrangements or family emergencies. Somehow, a decision involving his home had already been made without his knowledge, and everyone directly involved seemed surprised only by his reaction. Several guests quietly placed their drinks on nearby tables, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal. Daniel forced himself to remain composed because the last thing he wanted was to create a shouting match in front of people who had come to celebrate one of the happiest days of his life. Still, questions continued racing through his mind faster than he could ask them. Emily finally spoke, her voice noticeably softer than everyone else's. "Daniel, I honestly thought Ryan had talked to you weeks ago. I wouldn't have packed everything if I believed we were surprising you." Her words shifted the atmosphere inside the room. Until that moment, Daniel had assumed Ryan and Patricia were acting together while Emily simply followed along. Now it became clear that she, too, had been operating under information that wasn't entirely true. Ryan immediately looked uncomfortable. He avoided looking directly at either his wife or his brother. Instead, he focused on adjusting the handle of one suitcase, buying himself a few seconds before answering. I figured Mom had already mentioned it," he replied quietly. Patricia quickly interrupted before Daniel could respond. "There wasn't any reason to complicate things beforehand. I knew you'd eventually say yes because that's the kind of man you are." Those words landed harder than she realized. Daniel wasn't hearing praise. He was hearing expectation. For years, every sacrifice he had made had quietly become an obligation in the eyes of the people closest to him. Somewhere along the way, being dependable had stopped being appreciated and had simply become assumed. Trying to keep the evening from completely falling apart, Daniel suggested everyone move into the backyard while dinner continued. The guests welcomed the opportunity to escape the uncomfortable tension, grateful for an excuse to refill their plates and continue conversations that had abruptly ended moments earlier. As laughter slowly returned outside, Daniel remained inside with Ryan, Emily, and Patricia. The front door closed behind the last guest, leaving the 4 family members alone with the truth that could no longer be hidden behind polite smiles. Daniel looked at the 2 suitcases sitting on the polished hardwood floor he had spent the previous weekend installing himself. They weren't packed for a weekend visit. They were filled for a new beginning. "How long have you known about this?" Daniel asked quietly. Ryan hesitated before answering. "About 3 weeks." Daniel slowly turned toward his mother. "And you?" Patricia didn't even hesitate. "Since before they gave notice on their apartment." Daniel felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger, at least not yet. It was the realization that every person standing before him had shared conversations, made plans, and built expectations while deliberately leaving him out of decisions involving the very house he owned. The betrayal wasn't simply that they wanted to stay. It was that they believed permission was merely a formality. Ryan finally admitted what he had been trying to avoid. Their apartment lease hadn't unexpectedly ended. They had chosen not to renew it because Patricia assured them everything had already been arranged. She had repeatedly told them that Daniel had more than enough space, that he had always looked after the family, and that refusing them wasn't even something worth considering. Emily lowered her eyes as the full weight of that admission settled over the room. She realized that what she believed would be a temporary move agreed upon by everyone had instead become the center of a painful misunderstanding built on assumptions. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. He remembered countless moments from childhood when similar assumptions had shaped family decisions. Ryan borrowed things without asking because Daniel would understand. Ryan missed payments because someone else would help. Ryan changed jobs because another opportunity would appear. Every situation ended the same way. Daniel adjusted his own plans while everyone praised the importance of keeping the family together. Standing in the entryway of the home he had waited decades to own, he began wondering whether this wasn't the beginning of the problem at all. Perhaps this story had started more than 30 years earlier, when one son was taught that hard work solved problems while the other was taught that someone else eventually would. Daniel barely slept after the housewarming ended. Long after the last guest had driven away and the lights inside the neighborhood had gone dark, he sat alone in his living room staring at the two empty guest bedrooms that had suddenly become the center of a battle he never saw coming. Ryan and Emily had reluctantly taken a nearby hotel for the night after Daniel insisted that no one would be moving into the house until they had a proper conversation. Patricia left disappointed, convinced her oldest son was allowing pride to stand in the way of family. Yet Daniel wasn't thinking about pride. He was trying to understand how three people he loved could arrive believing they already had permission to live in a home he had never offered to share. Every memory from the evening replayed in his mind. Ryan hadn't looked surprised when Patricia made the announcement. Emily genuinely believed everything had been discussed weeks earlier. His mother never once asked what he wanted. She simply assumed that because he had always carried the heavier burden, he would continue carrying it without question. The following morning Daniel's phone rang before 8 o'clock. The caller ID displayed Patricia's name. He considered letting it ring until voicemail, but after a moment he answered anyway. She skipped the usual greetings. "Ryan and Emily are checking out of the hotel this afternoon," she said. "I'll bring them over around 3. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment before responding. "Mom, we haven't settled anything." There was a short pause on the other end before Patricia replied with a tone he hadn't heard since childhood. "Daniel, don't make this harder than it needs to be. They don't have anywhere else to go." Daniel calmly answered, "That doesn't change the fact that it's my decision." Patricia sighed heavily. "I knew this house would change you." Those words lingered after the call ended. It amazed Daniel that protecting the home he had earned through decades of sacrifice could somehow be interpreted as selfishness. The conversation left him with an uncomfortable realization. His mother wasn't trying to ask for help anymore. She believed she had the authority to decide what happened under his roof. Later that afternoon Daniel met his longtime friend and attorney, Thomas Reynolds, for lunch. The two men had known each other for more than 25 years, and Thomas had handled every major legal matter in Daniel's adult life, including the purchase of the house only a few months earlier. Daniel explained everything exactly as it had happened, expecting Thomas to reassure him that the situation was simply an emotional misunderstanding. Instead, Thomas became unusually serious. "Have you checked all the paperwork from your closing recently?" he asked. Daniel frowned. "Why would I?" Thomas leaned back in his chair before asking another question. "Has your mother ever had access to your personal documents or financial records?" Daniel thought carefully. Years earlier, before buying the house, Patricia had helped organize several boxes while he was moving out of his previous apartment. At the time, it seemed harmless. Thomas nodded slowly but didn't immediately explain why he was asking. "Daniel," he said quietly, "there's something I'd like you to verify before your family comes back this afternoon." Daniel drove home with an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite explain. Nothing Thomas had said directly accused anyone of wrongdoing, yet his questions suggested there was more to this story than misplaced assumptions. As he entered his home, he walked straight to the small office near the front hallway where he kept copies of every important document in a locked filing cabinet. The folder containing his mortgage papers was exactly where he remembered leaving it, but as he carefully reviewed each page, something immediately caught his attention. A document he distinctly remembered signing during the closing process was no longer there. At first he convinced himself he must have placed it in another folder. He searched every drawer, every cabinet, and every storage box inside the office. It was gone. The missing document wasn't the deed itself, but it contained detailed information about ownership records, emergency contacts, and several legal instructions that had been prepared alongside the purchase. Daniel stood motionless in the center of the room. The missing paperwork alone didn't prove anything, but combined with Patricia's remarkable confidence and Ryan's certainty that everything had already been arranged, it raised a question Daniel had never imagined asking about his own family. Were they simply making assumptions, or had someone been preparing for this moment much longer than anyone realized? Daniel forced himself to slow down. Years of managing multi-million-dollar distribution operations had taught him that panic often led people to overlook the most important details. He carefully returned every folder to the filing cabinet exactly as he had found it before checking the digital copies stored on an encrypted hard drive inside his desk. Fortunately, he had developed the habit of scanning every major document years earlier after a coworker lost valuable records during the flood. One by one, he compared the digital files with the papers still inside the cabinet. Everything matched until he reached the document that had disappeared. The scanned copy confirmed his memory. It contained emergency contact information, ownership declarations, and several notes prepared by the title company during closing. None of those pages gave anyone ownership of the property, but they revealed something else that immediately caught Daniel's attention. Someone had highlighted a sentence in yellow. He was certain he had never marked that page himself. The highlighted sentence wasn't legally significant, yet it seemed oddly specific. It simply stated that only the individuals listed on the recorded deed possessed any ownership interest in the property and that no verbal promises or informal family agreements could alter those rights. Daniel stared at the screen for several moments, trying to understand why anyone would single out that particular paragraph. Then another memory surfaced. During the weeks leading up to the closing, Patricia had repeatedly asked unusual questions about the buying process. She wanted to know whether homes automatically became family property after parents passed away. She wondered if siblings could eventually inherit portions even when only one person's name appeared on the paperwork. At the time, Daniel dismissed those questions as ordinary curiosity from a mother excited that her oldest son had finally achieved his dream. Looking back now, those conversations felt very different. They sounded less like casual questions and more like someone quietly collecting information before making plans of her own. Before Daniel could think any further, the doorbell rang. He looked through the front window and immediately recognized Patricia's sedan parked at the curb. Ryan climbed out of the passenger side while Emily stepped from the back seat. The two familiar suitcases rested in the trunk. Daniel took a deep breath before opening the door. Patricia smiled as though the disagreement from the previous evening had already been settled. "Perfect timing," she said cheerfully. "The guest rooms are upstairs, right?" Daniel remained standing in the doorway. "Nobody's bringing luggage inside today." Ryan's smile disappeared. Emily looked down at the driveway, clearly wishing she were somewhere else. Patricia's expression slowly hardened. "Daniel," she said quietly, "don't embarrass your brother in front of the neighbors." Daniel answered just as calmly. The embarrassment started when everyone else knew about this plan except the man who owns the house. For the first time since the confrontation began, Ryan spoke without looking toward his mother for reassurance. "Can we at least come inside and talk?" Daniel nodded and stepped aside, allowing the three of them into the living room while leaving the suitcases exactly where they were. Once everyone was seated, the silence became almost unbearable. Finally, Daniel asked the question that had been bothering him since the previous night. "When exactly did the two of you decide you were moving into my house?" Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Emily before answering. "About 6 weeks ago." Daniel frowned. 6 weeks? Ryan nodded. "Mom said she'd already spoken to you. She told us you wanted the extra rooms occupied because you hated living alone." Daniel slowly turned toward Patricia. She didn't deny it. Instead, she folded her hands and replied, "I knew that's what you'd eventually decide. I simply saved everyone an uncomfortable conversation." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mother hadn't misunderstood his intentions. She had spoken on his behalf, making promises she had absolutely no authority to make. Emily's voice broke the silence again, and this time there was genuine emotion behind every word. "Daniel, I need you to know something. I argued with Ryan before we packed. I asked him at least 3 times if you'd personally invited us. Every single time he told me yes. He said you'd already discussed everything over the phone." Ryan immediately looked down at the floor. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of weeks of half-truths had finally become impossible to carry. "I didn't exactly lie," he muttered. "I believed Mom." Emily turned toward him with disbelief. "You didn't believe her. You wanted to believe her because it solved our problem." Those words hung in the room. For the first time, Daniel realized Emily might not have been part of the plan at all. She had trusted her husband, who in turn had trusted years of promises from the one person who had always convinced him that someone else would eventually make everything right. But Daniel couldn't ignore one troubling question. Why had Patricia been so determined to move them into his house? Helping Ryan find temporary shelter was one thing. Insisting that Daniel had already agreed, without ever asking him, was something entirely different. And deep inside, Daniel was beginning to suspect that the answer had very little to do with compassion and everything to do with a promise Patricia had made decades earlier, a promise she believed she was finally ready to fulfill. Daniel studied his mother's face more carefully than he had in years. Patricia had always been remarkably composed during difficult conversations. Even when emotions ran high, she rarely raised her voice. Instead, she relied on certainty. She spoke as though her opinion naturally settled every disagreement, and for most of the family's life, it had. Ryan usually gave in because arguing with her exhausted him. Other relatives simply nodded along to avoid conflict during holidays. Daniel had done the same countless times, convincing himself that keeping the peace mattered more than proving a point. But standing in the living room of the home he had spent 2 decades working toward, he realized something had changed. This wasn't a disagreement about dinner plans or family traditions. It was about ownership, trust, and the belief that someone else's sacrifice could simply become available whenever another family member needed it. Patricia met his gaze without looking away. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly. "You think I've crossed the line." Daniel answered just as calmly. "No, Mom. I know you have." The room fell silent again before Patricia slowly leaned forward in her chair. "Then maybe it's finally time you understood why I made the decisions I did." Daniel frowned, unsure where the conversation was heading. Ryan looked equally confused, while Emily quietly folded her hands together, sensing that something much larger than a disagreement over temporary housing was about to surface. Patricia took a slow breath before continuing. "Your father made me promise something before he passed away." Daniel's expression immediately changed. Their father, Richard Harper, had died almost 15 years earlier after a sudden heart attack. He had been a hard-working electrician known throughout their town for his honesty and quiet nature. Daniel had always believed he understood everything about his father's life because they had been incredibly close. Richard had taught him how to repair almost anything around the house, how to save money instead of chasing appearances, and how a man's word carried more value than any contract. Never once had Daniel heard his father mention any promise involving the family home or his 2 sons. "What promise?" Daniel asked softly. Patricia lowered her eyes before answering. "He didn't want either of his boys left behind. He told me everything the family built should belong to both of you someday." Daniel sat motionless as those words settled over the room. At first they sounded reasonable. Any loving father would hope both of his children enjoyed stable lives. But the more he thought about Patricia's interpretation, the less sense it made. Richard had never encouraged entitlement. In fact, Daniel remembered his father saying the exact opposite on more than one occasion. When Ryan skipped jobs because he didn't like the hours, Richard would gently remind him that nobody was owed comfort before responsibility. When Daniel purchased his first used pickup truck with money he had saved for years, his father proudly told him that owning something meant appreciating the work required to earn it. Those lessons had shaped Daniel's entire adult life. They were completely inconsistent with the idea that Richard expected one son to surrender his biggest achievement simply because the other needed help. "Dad never said anything like that to me," Daniel replied. Patricia nodded slowly. "Of course he didn't. He told me because he knew I would make sure it happened." Ryan looked from his mother to Daniel with growing uncertainty. "Mom, are you saying Dad actually wanted us to share Daniel's house?" Patricia hesitated for the first time since arriving. "Not this specific house," she admitted. "He wanted both of you to always have a home." Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. The distinction was impossible to ignore. There was an enormous difference between wishing security for both sons and believing one son's property automatically belonged to the other. Daniel noticed it immediately. "That's not the same thing," he said. Patricia quickly answered, "Maybe not legally." The moment those words left her mouth, Daniel understood something important. His mother wasn't arguing about law anymore. She was defending years of personal decisions built upon her own interpretation of a private conversation that no one else had heard. She had gradually transformed a father's wish for unity into a rule that allowed her to make promises she had no authority to make. Whether she realized it or not, she had spent years convincing Ryan that family obligation could replace personal responsibility. Before anyone could respond, Daniel's phone vibrated on the coffee table. The caller was Thomas Reynolds. Daniel excused himself and stepped into the kitchen to answer. Thomas's voice was unusually direct. Daniel, I spoke with someone at the title company this afternoon. Daniel immediately sensed the importance of the call. Did you find something? There was a brief pause before Thomas replied. Yes. Someone contacted the office about your property nearly 2 months before the closing. They weren't asking about mortgage rates or taxes. They specifically wanted to know whether additional family members could be added to the ownership documents after the purchase without the buyer being present. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. Did they identify who made the inquiry? Thomas answered carefully. The employee couldn't release personal information over the phone, but she did remember one detail. The caller repeatedly referred to the buyer as my oldest son. Daniel slowly looked through the kitchen doorway toward the living room, where Patricia sat waiting with complete confidence that eventually everything would work out exactly as she had planned. In that instant, Daniel realized this wasn't a misunderstanding born from desperation after Ryan lost his apartment. The questions had begun months before he ever received the keys to the house. Someone had been thinking about his future home long before it officially became his, and that realization changed everything. Daniel ended the call without saying another word. For several seconds he remained standing in the kitchen, staring through the window above the sink toward the backyard he had imagined filling with grandchildren, family barbecues, and peaceful summer evenings. When he first bought the house, every room represented a reward for years of patience. Now, less than a month after moving in, those same rooms felt like evidence in a case he never expected to investigate. Thomas hadn't accused Patricia of breaking any law. Asking questions about property ownership wasn't illegal. But the timing of those questions raised concerns Daniel could no longer ignore. His mother had begun exploring ways to involve Ryan with the house months before Daniel had even finished signing the closing documents. That wasn't a last-minute attempt to help a son in need. It suggested a plan that had existed quietly in the background while Daniel believed everyone was simply celebrating his achievement. He took a slow breath before returning to the living room, determined that this conversation would finally reach the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it became. When Daniel walked back into the room, everyone immediately noticed the change in his expression. The confusion that had filled his face the previous evening was gone. In its place was quiet determination. He remained standing instead of taking his seat. "Mom," he began, "I just spoke with my attorney." Patricia's confident smile faded slightly, though she quickly recovered. "Why would you need a lawyer for a family conversation?" Daniel answered without raising his voice. "Because this stopped being just a family conversation the moment decisions about my property were made without my knowledge." Ryan shifted uneasily in his chair while Emily looked back and forth between the two of them. Daniel continued. "Thomas told me someone contacted the title company before I even closed on this house. That person wanted to know if additional family members could be added to the ownership records after the purchase." The room fell silent. Patricia's eyes briefly widened before she looked away. It lasted only a second, but Daniel noticed. Ryan noticed it too. Emily slowly turned toward her mother-in-law, waiting for an explanation that never came. Finally Patricia spoke. "I only wanted information." Daniel nodded. "I believe you. But I need to understand why you were asking those questions before I'd even received the keys." Patricia folded her arms across her chest. "Because I knew someday Ryan would need stability and I wanted to know what options existed." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, Mom. You didn't ask how to help Ryan. You asked how to place other family members on the ownership of a house that wasn't yours." Ryan's face lost all color. "Mom, is that true?" Patricia quickly turned toward him. "I wasn't trying to take anything away from Daniel." "Then what exactly were you trying to do?" Daniel asked. She struggled to answer. For the first time since arriving, certainty abandoned her. Every explanation she considered seemed to collapse under the weight of one undeniable fact. She had explored legal possibilities involving someone else's property without ever mentioning it to the owner. Even if nothing had come from those inquiries, the intention behind them could no longer be ignored. Ryan slowly stood from his chair and took several steps away from his mother. "You told me Daniel already wanted us here," he said quietly. Patricia remained silent. "You told Emily the same thing." Still nothing. Ryan rubbed his forehead as memories began fitting together in ways they never had before. He remembered every reassuring phone call, every promise that everything had already been arranged, every insistence that Daniel would never object because it's family. At the time, Ryan hadn't questioned any of it because believing his mother was easier than confronting the reality of his own financial problems. But now another possibility emerged, one he had desperately avoided. Did Daniel ever actually say yes? He asked. Patricia didn't answer immediately. Instead, tears slowly filled her eyes. I knew he would eventually. Ryan took another step backward. That's not what I asked. The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Emily lowered her head, realizing that weeks of planning, packing, and preparing for a fresh start had been built on assumptions instead of truth. Daniel looked at his younger brother and, for the first time in years, saw not the carefree man everyone constantly rescued but someone beginning to understand the consequences of trusting promises that were never his to rely on. Just as Daniel believed the hardest part of the conversation was finally behind them, Patricia quietly whispered something that immediately changed the direction of everything. There was another reason. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She reached into her handbag with trembling hands and removed an old, weathered envelope whose edges had faded with time. It was sealed, but Daniel recognized the handwriting on the front before she even spoke another word. It belonged to his father. Across the front, in careful blue ink, were 5 words that instantly sent a chill through the room: to be opened together someday. Daniel stared at the envelope, trying to remember ever seeing it before, but nothing came to mind. Patricia held it tightly against her chest before looking at both of her sons. I've kept this hidden for 15 years, she said softly. Your father made me promise not to open it until the moment I believed our family was about to fall apart. No one spoke. The envelope suddenly carried more weight than every argument that had taken place since the housewarming party began. Whatever Richard Harper had written all those years ago had remained locked away while assumptions, misunderstandings, and silent expectations shaped the lives of everyone in that room. And Daniel couldn't help wondering whether the letter would heal the family, or reveal a truth far more devastating than any of them were prepared to hear. For several moments, no one moved. The envelope rested in Patricia's hands like a piece of history that had somehow survived long enough to change the present. Daniel could hear the ticking of the clock on the living room wall, a sound he had barely noticed before. Ryan stood near the window, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and regret, while Emily remained silent, sensing that whatever happened next would determine the future of this family far more than any argument about bedrooms or suitcases. Patricia carefully traced her fingers along the faded edges of the envelope. It was old enough that the paper had begun to yellow, yet Richard Harper's handwriting remained unmistakable. Daniel remembered watching his father write grocery lists, notes for electrical jobs, and birthday cards over the years. The letters were the same. Neat. Patient. Thoughtful. Suddenly, memories Daniel hadn't revisited in years returned all at once. His father's laugh during summer cookouts. Long evenings repairing old equipment in the garage. Quiet conversations about responsibility and hard work. Richard had never been a man of dramatic speeches. When he had something important to say, he usually said it simply. That was why the existence of this hidden letter felt so unusual. If his father had written something intended to be read only after 15 years, then whatever it contained mattered deeply to him. Patricia finally broke the seal with trembling hands. For a moment, Daniel wondered whether he even wanted to hear what was inside. Over the past 2 days, he had discovered that assumptions, promises, and unspoken expectations could reshape entire relationships. Another part of him feared that the letter might somehow confirm everything Patricia believed. What if his father had truly expected Daniel to share everything equally with Ryan? What if all these years Daniel had misunderstood the values he thought Richard had taught him? Patricia unfolded the paper carefully and looked at both of her sons. Tears filled her eyes before she began reading. To my boys, Daniel and Ryan. If you are hearing this letter, then it means there is disagreement between you, and that saddens me more than words can explain. I have spent my life working with my hands, and I learned something important along the way. A family can survive hardship, loss, and disappointment, but resentment, if left unattended, grows quietly for years until people no longer recognize each other. That is why I want you both to understand something clearly. I never believed fairness meant giving everyone the same thing. Fairness means giving people the chance to build their own lives with dignity. Patricia paused, and Daniel felt his chest tighten. The words sounded exactly like his father. Simple. Direct. Honest. She continued reading. Daniel, you have always carried more responsibility than most people your age. I know that. Ryan, your road has been different, and life has taught you lessons in ways I wish it had not. But listen carefully. Neither of you owes the other your future. A home earned through sacrifice belongs to the person who earned it. Help each other when you can, stand beside each other when life becomes difficult, but never confuse love with obligation. Real help should lift a person toward independence, not make them dependent on someone else's hard work. If either of you ever faces difficult times, support one another with wisdom, not guilt. And Patricia, if you're reading this too, remember that protecting one child should never come at the cost of burdening another. Your love must be equal, even when your worries are not. The room became completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. The words settled over the family like a truth that had waited 15 years to be heard. Patricia slowly lowered the letter. Tears ran quietly down her face. For years, she had carried her own interpretation of Richard's wishes, convinced that keeping the family close meant ensuring that Ryan would always have someone to rely on. But now, hearing Richard's actual words, she realized how much she had added to them over time. A hope for unity had gradually become an expectation. Concern had slowly become control. Daniel looked at his mother and saw something he hadn't seen in many years. Not certainty. Not confidence. Regret. Ryan sat down heavily, staring at the floor. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood that many of the choices he had made had been softened by promises that should never have been made in the first place. His mother had always stepped in because she loved him, but that love had also protected him from consequences that might have changed his life years earlier. Emily quietly reached for Ryan's hand, and he held it tightly, as though realizing that the future he wanted could no longer be built on assumptions or rescue. Daniel stood and walked toward the large front window overlooking the quiet street. The dream home he had spent 20 years earning still belonged to him, yet somehow the argument was no longer only about property, it was about patterns repeated over decades. It was about good intentions that slowly became harmful expectations. It was about two brothers who had grown into very different men because they had been taught very different lessons about responsibility. After a long silence, Daniel turned back toward his family. "Ryan," he said calmly, "you and Emily cannot move in here." Ryan nodded before Daniel even finished speaking. There was disappointment in his eyes, but there was also understanding. Then Daniel continued, "But I will help you find another way." Ryan looked up. Daniel explained that he would help his brother create a financial plan, connect him with a friend who managed a construction company looking for experienced supervisors, and assist with temporary housing while they got back on their feet. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't ownership. It was something much more valuable. It was a chance to rebuild with dignity. Patricia quietly folded Richard's letter and placed it back into the envelope. The house remained silent, but it was a different silence than the one that followed her announcement at the housewarming party. That silence had been filled with shock and confusion. This silence carried reflection. Years of assumptions had finally been spoken aloud. Old wounds had finally been acknowledged. And while no family conversation can erase decades of habits in a single afternoon, something important had changed. Ryan no longer expected rescue. Patricia no longer believed love meant making decisions for everyone. And Daniel no longer felt guilty for protecting what he had spent a lifetime earning. Sometimes the strongest families are not the ones who avoid difficult conversations. They are the ones willing to face uncomfortable truths before those truths quietly destroy everything. And perhaps that is the question this story leaves behind. When does helping family become enabling? And if you had been in Daniel's position, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments, because stories like this happen more often than most people realize, and every family answers that question differently.